Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Hi, this is Lisa from This Jungian Life podcast. Joseph, Deb, and I have been deeply moved by your responses to our work. Producing, editing, and distributing the podcast involves substantial expenses, and we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading, Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us for as little as $1 a month, and at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Thank you.
In today's podcast, we're going to be talking about escaping literalism. And in a very informal way, just stop taking things so literally. What does it take to look under the surface of our dreams, to look under the surface of our relationships, to look under the surface of other people's behavior, to look under the surface of the news and literature, and to really reject that things are simply what they are at face value. And that's what we mean by having a depth perspective, going deeper.
You're right. It's not rejecting that the face value is true in some sense. It's just rejecting the thought that that's all there is. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So children are hilariously very literal. And when we were talking about recording this, there were a number of charming and funny examples of children overhearing adult language or adult conversation and, in these wide-eyed moments, taking it really literally.
Yes.
Yeah, my son was 6 years old when Osama bin Laden was captured and killed, and we were all listening rapt to the news in the car about the Navy SEALs, and then the SEALs did this and the SEALs did that. And when it was over, he said, Mom, SEALs killed that man? We went to clarify.
Those vicious attacking SEAls.
Absolutely.
They can be really
Those
tough.
aquatic mammals, we've got them really well trained.
It was great.
And the moment that he didn't unpack it, but just the tone of his voice and the look in his eyes, that you knew what he was talking about.
So that's a lack of knowledge, that at 6 he doesn't know about Navy SEAls.
He thought there was something more to the story.
Yes, exactly. There's something didn't quite add up. And I'm thinking that it takes a certain stage of development to understand metaphor. So my story about that is when my son was a boy, I said something in the summer about we're really in the dog days of August. And he thought that meant that we were going to get a dog. And he said, when does the dog come? A day or two later. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you said we're in the dog days of August. So
he was really disappointed.
So I think this escaping literalism and developing a symbolic attitude includes things that are just a knowledge base and the ability to understand metaphor.
Absolutely. And to believe that there is an unconscious dimension to what appears in the conscious dialogue or the conscious presentation. And so in a more conventional relational sense, I've had clients in the office and they're very, very upset and maybe they're dating somebody. And in the midst of an argument, the girlfriend says, I have had enough. And then the conversation ends, and then people are left thinking the relationship is over, and what does enough mean? And is everything shattered? and not being able to go under the surface of the statement or the situation to probe the subtle dynamics of what that phrase meant in their own minds or with the other person before they come to taking it too much on a face value.
So,
making
and
a conclusion.
that sounds like a particularly wounding incident. So we could have empathy for someone who might have misinterpreted that. But there can be a kind of laziness that goes, a kind of cognitive laziness that goes along with just saying, well, what's on the surface is what is, without being kind of curious about, well, what are some different ways we might understand this? And of course, I mean, part of the discipline, I think, of analytic work is just getting used to always saying, and what else? And what else? And what else could this mean? And is there another way of looking at it? And could it also be this?
I think the old Freudians called that mentalizing, which is this way of not being locked into a prescribed perspective.
Yes.
Which is generally based on defenses and habits.
I'm relating this just to relationships, and that the person that says, that's it, I've had enough, I'm done. And that if the conversation ends there, it's a cognitive laziness, but it's also an empathic failure to say, wow, you're really upset by this. What's going on? To hang in there with the other person rather than just being frustrated or angry yourself and saying, fine. And then both people stomp off in their different directions. Maybe a repair is made later, maybe not. But the underlying issue of what are you feeling hasn't been addressed in a transaction like that.
And even that is not taking things at face value, because one has to imagine there is another dimension that was not immediately expressed and yet is still there. And many people don't function that way. Many people are extremely concrete.
Yeah. Michael Meade, the mythologist, has this quote that I really like. He says, literalism is the great spell that binds and blinds the modern world. And Jung was very, very much in agreement. I mean, he felt that symbol formation was an extremely important biological function, that it was inherent to being human, that it's always been with us, and that we absolutely must have a symbolic life. And of course, he has a book by that name.
That's right.
So now we're dropping into a little bit of esoterica around how Jungians think about symbols themselves, which might appear in a dream, or symbolic themes might be visible or perceptible in any number of different circumstances. So let's make that shift, since we brought the quote in, and then we'll bring it back perhaps to how that is a medicine with which we can address literalism. So let's talk about examples of symbols, perhaps, and the different ways that we can unpack what a symbol is that is unique to our understanding, so we can define our terms.
A symbol that I think is deep in the human psyche and comes up fairly frequently in dreams is the symbol of the horse. So what is a horse? What is a horse in the dream of this person or that person? What is the horse doing? There's a horse that's running free. There's a horse that's trapped in a basement. There's a horse that's giving birth. It goes on of what is a horse and what's happening here. And I think symbolically that a horse is an animal, of course, and has its own instincts and can gallop and run. But there's an opportunity to ride a horse, or in a particular dream, perhaps not, which to me represents the developed ego, cognition, consciousness of a human, with having a connection with a productive connection with instinctual energy. And it's that linking function always of consciousness and unconscious that I think can be in all kinds of symbolic images, but the horse is just the example that I'm pulling out for now.
So if we hold on to Deb's exercise of looking at a horse as a symbol and not just, let's say, as a memory of a horse that you had encountered, that the image of the horse is conscious. We know we're looking at an image of a horse, but that just gives us a clue as to something that's happening in the background, in the unconscious field. And that attitude of saying, yes, it's a horse, and I know what a horse is, but there's something it's pointing to that is more than just perhaps the fact that I had ridden a horse one time in my life, and that we don't want to take it just as a literal horse, perhaps again that I rode years ago, but is pointing to something that is more mysterious and more potent.
Right. I mean, Jung said something like a symbol is the best possible expression for something unknown. And this is, I think, particularly Jungian, that symbols always point beyond themselves to something much, much larger. And that's why we all bristle a bit at this idea of these kind of online dream dictionaries where, you dream about a horse and you go to the dream dictionary and it says, yeah, if you dream about a horse, you're dreaming about power or whatever it is, because it's not a simple equals sign. It's a much more nuanced, layered, it's almost like it is an attitude. To look at something symbolically, it's not just a translation of horse equals something. It's bigger and it's more mysterious, and you have to feel your way in to the image, leading with your intuition.
Building upon that, there's a way that we imagine the psychology of an individual, that there is a conscious part of us, which we'll call the ego, and the ego has attitudes and beliefs and is moving in a particular direction. And then there really is an unconscious that isn't theoretical, but in a sense, a whole other kind of enormous personality that has attitudes and images and instincts and impulses that in fact is so enormous that it couldn't really be lived out in any one person's life, but that these two personalities that we all have are constantly pressing upon each other, which creates a tension inside of us in any number of circumstances. There is miraculously, and thank goodness, something in the human psychology, something in the human soul that addresses this tension between those two enormous parts of ourselves. And the evidence of that is the self-generation of symbols. If we take Deb's idea of the horse, and let's imagine that it was a dream. So an individual is dreaming of a horse, and as Deb was saying, maybe they were riding it, maybe it was running, and there's all kinds of context around the internal image. One of the attitudes we take is that the horse symbol actually has a kind of goal and intentionality. It's trying to do something inside of the psychology of the person to somehow resolve the tension and competition between the conscious personality and this unconscious personality and move things forward.
Yeah, Jung was really interested in the way that symbols can redirect and transform psychic energy. They're like transformers.
I'm also thinking about there's a way that people could understand what you just articulated so well, Joseph, of what the message is of, then this dream must mean that I really need to
go out rail trotting.
capture that wild horse and tame it and learn to ride. It would be like, well, so what's missing here is a felt connection to, oh my goodness, there's a wild horse here that has some magical properties. Where is that in me? What might I learn to be in relation to? It's a little bit psychically speaking, and I think it's always a process with people who are new to analysis or psychotherapy of really relating to a dream image like the horse. That's a little bit like those magic eye books, and sometimes I use them in the consulting room.
Oh, do you? That's
great.
And
the pages can be sort of sliced out so that they're easy to hand out. And these are images, if you're not familiar with them, where there's a sort of all-over vague kind of pattern that's not very crisp or clear, and the skill involved in seeing the pattern is to sort of soften your eyes a little bit, the way that you do sometimes if you see your reflection in something like a car's exterior. The focus shifts a little bit. Takes a little practice, a little intentionality, a little relaxation, and then ping. Up pops a 3D image of lots of flowers or any one of a number of things. And so all of a sudden, the meaning in this diffuse, all over, not particularly interesting design really pops up, and you literally see it differently.
Yeah.
And I'm using that as an example or a metaphor for how we can see things differently. Of like, oh,
right.
It's there's
a whole
life.
different way of looking at things.
Yes,
isn't it?
different way of looking.
That brings depth and dimensionality.
And surprise. Of look what the dream maker sent me. Or look what the hidden meaning is in an interaction that I had with my neighbor, my spouse, my boss.
Yeah, I think that when you cultivate a symbolic attitude, it kind of makes the world new again. It kind of creates a world that is saturated with meaning and intensity. It's not all good. But you feel connected with something larger when you're really living in a symbolic with a symbolic attitude, because it's like you are being companioned by that unconscious part of yourself, because the psyche speaks in symbol, in intuitions, in dream images, in moods, and in symptoms. And if we can, sort of do the magic eye thing to the point where we're listening for that and hearing it and receiving it, even if we sometimes get it wrong, life is just infinitely richer.
It makes the world much bigger. And I know, Jung's, the value he placed on myth and fairy tale was to enable people, us, to see that we are part of a much, much larger whole. And that can help to see what the human condition is, that it's not just all about me. Things are not just cut and dried. The world is a vast tapestry, and I am a part of it.
Yeah.
That it's living life in some ways poetically, that there is a poetry in even the smallest things if we have a mind to bring that forward, and sometimes the courage to do it. So I want to think about, give an example of a symbolic attitude that it was just very benign. But I had a client many years ago, and it just comes back to me. I would say for the first year of their analysis that, and it really, it must have been every single session, the person would have a seat and they would take out of her purse a little pad of paper and a pen, and they would immediately drop the pen on the floor, and then they would have to pick it up, which is such a ubiquitous action that you wouldn't think about it. Oh, the pen slipped out of their hand. But it would be the start of every single session, was the dropping of the pen and then scurrying around and picking up the pen again. So there's little moments like that we could all just take at face value. She's just clumsy. But at a certain point, it was really interesting for us to think about the poetry of starting every session by dropping the pen.
Oh, I love that you called it poetry. That's really lovely.
So as we thought about it, we came up with a couple of hypotheses or poetic stances. Is the pen dropping out of the hand because some part of her unconscious mind doesn't want her ego to be such a good recording student in the room? That is it part of me being a teacher for her and she being a dutiful student and wanting to demonstrate that through taking notes during the session? And was the unconscious personality sending this little jolt of energy into her hand, kind of knocking the pen away? So, what would it be like to not take notes during the session? Now, we don't know if that's exactly what it meant, but it broadened the perspective on the dropping of the pen, so we had a little more breathing room. Another attitude that we came around that is some part of her struggling to remember, is defending against remembering insights. so that even though she has an intentionality to remember what we're doing or what's valuable that rises up in the session, there's a complex inside of her that actually really makes it difficult, that she has to fight to really relate to what's going on. And perhaps it's even heroic for her to grab the pen and not let it be knocked out of her hand, which is a very different attitude. But now we have three things in the room: that the pen should fly out of her hand, she's got to grab the pen, and that she's just clumsy. which is the literal attitude. But all of a sudden now we have three options.
Yes.
But I'm thinking about, again, how much bigger this makes her world and your shared world in the consulting room to think about these other possibilities rather than limiting it to, oh, dropped the pen again. Oh, well, just let's breeze past that and not pay attention to it because it's just a little thing. And that it makes it so much more interesting and so much more enlivening in the inner world to say, wow, what is this about?
I was having a similar imagination. I can imagine how the feeling in the room, the feeling tone in the room must have changed as you started talking about this. And my guess is it just sort of was like, just like a jolt of electricity in the room, or that moment in The Wizard of Oz when Dorothy steps out of the house and everything's in Technicolor. It's like, wow, there's something going on here. Now there's a little mystery.
And that you're saying, I think implicit in all this is you are bigger than that. Look how big you are. It's not just a pen falling on the floor. And maybe it's that, but it could be so much more, and introducing someone to how much more of her there really is. There's much more life inside. There could be another whole part of her, the unconscious, that is speaking through this repeated action of dropping the pen. And that's why we do dream analysis. There's another part of us that visits every night and tells us much more about ourselves.
I think that that is also true. I want to come back to Lisa's lifting up that when we begin with a client or even in ourselves to lean towards the symbolic attitude, there is a jolt in the room. And sometimes it shows up as embarrassment, as if somebody has been revealed as naked in a certain sense. So the first impulse is often for people to blush.
And kind of be defended against it. Which is why I like that you used poetry.
Yeah. That there's no, righteous position around it. It's just dropping a pen. But we often feel very embarrassed that we could have been doing something that in fact was secretly meaningful or observed by other people. And there is a way in which the ego wants to just reflexively tighten it all up again and dismiss it. Now, the dropping of the pen happened to be such a benign thing that we could kind of get through that quickly and then just have fun with this idea of the poetry of the motion of the event. But that idea of tightening up and not wanting or feeling defensive about looking at other deeper meanings is really a challenge and brings us to, I think, a hugely important reality that people use literalism as a defense. That because the unconscious is going to perhaps shake up our position, shake up our sense of what we think was the right way, and we have a feeling that could happen. So we want to tighten things, tamp them down, or have this impulse to dismiss.
Being very dismissive of the unconscious. I think it's a defense. I think it's a defense against being found out and being shamed, perhaps, as you're saying, Joseph, or the fear that might happen. But it's also a defense against this other within us that is so much larger. And, the ego wants to believe it's in control.
It wants to be the king and queen.
Yeah. So absolutely. People I see, very dismissive against the unconscious. I mean, one of the things that pops up for me on a kind of literary level is Dickens' A Christmas Carol. And when Marley appears, Scrooge says, he says something like, you're just an undigested bit of old beef.
Yes,
or something,
exactly.
right?
That's the Freudian interpretation.
Yes. Yeah. you're sort of nothing but, in some sense, that's such a psychological story because Marley has appeared to him to teach him something, which is sort of like our dreams. And people can come in and be very dismissive of their dreams. I mean, this is very common.
Yes.
Well, someone will come in, well, I had a dream last night, but I know I just had it because I had a fight with my coworker.
Mm-hmm. They're already dismissing.
And they it's not important and they already know what it means. And so well, let's talk about it, and I can pretty much guarantee you it's never just that she had a fight with her coworker. But there are people that will do that week after week after week.
It's I like your phrase of the nothing but, that the literal attitude is it's nothing but. And for Scrooge, the appearance of Marley was nothing but sort of acid reflux or something.
He just needed some Zantac.
Yeah, exactly.
There you go.
It really, I'm having a reaction to that of what a small, tight, rigid world that would mandate versus something much, much bigger. And of course, in A Christmas Carol, the appearance of Marley and what Scrooge has to learn is much deeper and much more, requires more suffering than someone who simply drops a pen. But look how much larger Scrooge's world became. He became related, he became kind, he became generous.
Yeah.
He became so much more just for himself.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the end of the story where he realizes that it's still Christmas. Like he opens the window and he's just overjoyed. And that's sort of the renewal that the symbolic attitude can bring.
And that is the gift of the symbolic attitude, is that it brings us joy. And I don't mean by joy that it's just a nice, warm, fuzzy, happy feeling of puppy dogs and rainbows, but it brings us that fierce enlivenment
I like
and
that.
meaning.
And if we can just keep on riffing on Dickens here for a second, it's a good analogy as well because facing these emissaries from the beyond is terrifying. Like we were saying, there's this tendency to want to defend against it because it's not the known. We have to surrender ourselves to the unknown to cultivate a symbolic attitude.
Absolutely. I think it's, even if people aren't literally kind of shaking in the room, but there's enough anxiety to want to dismiss it. And so, as we had mentioned before, even people who come for a Jungian analysis, who've read some of Jung's books and they're on board, it takes a while for people to really tolerate the idea that the unconscious is real.
Yes.
That it takes a long time to really think that, and that the things that are happening inside of us are not under the control of the ego, which we talk about is the autonomy of the unconscious, that whatever generates the action of dropping the pen or the dreams of the horse or Marley is not under the control of the ego. And that is an initiatic opportunity because the omnipotence of the ego, which, by the way, we do need to feel as children in order to cobble together a personality, later in life has to be dethroned, and we have to share power inside of ourselves between our conscious plans and this unconscious wisdom. And that's a very gentle, uncertain relationship that it takes a long time for people to buy into.
Yeah, and it's hard too. I mean, the three of us do some teaching and working with training candidates and that type of thing. And, I'll work with people on dream interpretation, and they'll have a dream about the coworker in their office, let's say, or maybe someone they knew 5 years ago. And they'll say, well, I just, I think I had that dream because, the ego, the dream is telling me that she's a really bad person and I shouldn't trust her, because that's the way they feel about the person in waking life. And I'll say, well, wait a second, remember that this is probably showing a part of you, that the evil coworker in the dream is actually a part of the psyche. And it's hard. And even people that are learning how to do this and have spent years learning will, it's like, oh, that's right. Shifting into that again, Deb, back to your magic eye example, like finding that place where your vision is just relaxed enough to be able to see these layers. It's difficult. It's really difficult. It takes a lot of discipline and practice.
And it takes a willingness with that surprise of like, oh, you mean my horrible coworker that was a dream image is somehow maybe part of my own shadow? I'm not like that.
Yeah.
So, of course, we defend against some of it. As the dream maker can send us some things just like Marley was sent to Scrooge that's hard to hear.
We want to know about.
Wait a minute.
So some things we can learn through the symbolic attitude can be exciting and creative and enlivening. And some of the things we learn are deeply humbling.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And, humble and humus, which is the word for earth, to be humbled is to be brought down to the earth again. And, that can be a bruising experience.
And at the same time, how wonderful to know that we actually are connected with something larger than ourselves. Like the ego wants to be the king and queen, but then how wonderful to realize that we're not all what we know.
Right.
We're bigger than that. Sometimes I'll have someone come in with a dream and say, well, I had a dream, but it wasn't, it was nothing. That happens so often. And I will sometimes say, why are you being so dismissive of the gift you were given? It often makes people sort of tear up because they can see how dismissive they were toward their unconscious that was attempting to, companion them.
So the attitude one would have to cultivate over time is to be curious about the unconscious, to be curious where symbols are pointing, to do everything we can to welcome what these messages might be and to take them seriously. I think it's important for us to be suspicious when we find ourselves saying, well, that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. I think a part of the symbolic attitude requires us to say, well, maybe everything matters. Maybe the dropping of the pen does matter, and maybe the fact that the side of my neck aches every time I go and visit my neighbor matters, that it matters and it means something, even though I might not know it right away, but there's a mystery in it. I want to lean into another aspect of literalism, which is very hot right now, I think, in the world, and it has to do with religious literalism. And when people concretize ideas and go to great lengths to make them exclusively concrete. And so right now, I think because of the conflicts in the Middle East, Americans can be very dismissive of Islamic sacred literature and look at it literally and find it, really troublesome based on American values. And at the same time, look at the Old Testament, which is a very ancient document, take it literally and use it and weaponize it through literalism, convenient literalism. So whether or not we're interpreting a dream, or we're interpreting events around us, or interpreting sacred literature, descending into an exclusive, concrete, literal attitude cuts us off.
It's deadening.
It's deadening, and it can be dangerous.
Yes. I'm thinking about that word deadening versus the word I used earlier of enlivening. And so, we can check inside of how is this affecting me? What's the feeling tone here? Because the unconscious and that part of ourselves knows of, this feels restrictive and deadening, and okay, that's the way it is. Versus, wow, there could be something I need to pay attention to, something that has caught my interest, something that's leading me on here. And we know what we feel when we feel it. We instinctively, I think, recognize whether something is closing us in and shutting something down versus opening something up and contributing to forward momentum of psyche.
And finding these deeper dimensions of something, as Deb had said, brings life to it. So let's just say, you've been involved in a particular kind of church and you're used to a particular theological doctrine towards your religion. And after decades, it's not uncommon for people to feel a deadened quality.
Yeah.
And part of that is they're taking the sacred texts and maybe even the rituals of their religion literally, that they're no longer asking the similar kinds of questions one might in an analytic session, which is, where is this pointing? What's underneath it? What are all the metaphoric ways of relating to this? What is it symbolically talking about? And that is a way of reinvigorating our religion, our philosophies, as well as relationships, and our personal psychology, that we need a symbolic attitude, or else things become dry and dusty.
Yeah, and you were talking about the danger, Joseph, and I appreciate you linking it to things in the collective. For example, with religion, I think it's also present in how we conceptualize psychiatric diagnoses, and it can be dangerous there too. So, for example, depression is, this diagnosis, and we have these criteria, and we understand it, at least in part, to be, a problem with serotonin levels in the brain or something. Of course, there is some biology there for sure, but when we reduce it to nothing but, we stop being curious about it. We stop wondering if it might be the way that our psyche is trying to tell us something.
The nothing but and the reductionism are really deadening, because then it's over. Versus what more might be going on in me. What is this trying to tell me? And what do I need to pay attention to here? And that's empowering versus the nothing but.
Right.
Well, you can take this medication and, hopefully you'll feel better.
Or your depression is nothing but an issue of serotonin.
Yes, exactly.
And this idea that there is no other meaning, or that nothing else matters.
Right. That I think is maybe the key, is that with a symbolic attitude, there's an assumption that there is meaning.
Right.
We might not know what it is. We might have trouble finding it, but the assumption is that there's meaning. With literalism, the assumption is that there's nothing but.
Yeah, the meaning is fixed, it's concrete, and that's all there is.
Right. Yes.
And there's a very collective attitude about it. This is the meaning, and everyone shall have this meaning. Everyone will take this ascribed position, the stance. And depending on how rigid the defense is, it becomes heretical to not repeat the prescribed attitude. And the big, of course, horror people are feeling is watching A Handmaid's Tale, on television these days. Which is some of these fantasized social outcomes around religious literalism. And there is only one way, and if you don't believe this, you will be extraordinarily punished.
How oppressive, such an allegory about oppressive, rigid rule structures where even dress was prescribed according to your role and station in life. Versus, I'll throw in another idea here, versus adventure. And I'm thinking about all of the games now on various devices and fairy tales, things like Lord of the Rings, of the call to adventure, of what if there's more? Yeah, what if you do meet a dragon on the trail? But what if you meet a talking animal? And that wonderful scene of where Frodo or Bilbo goes galloping out, the magical creatures visit him and say, "Come on, you're supposed to go on this quest with us." And he's a nice little hobbit, and he says, "No, I want to stay here in my village and be and enjoy my life." And they eventually accept his decision and off they go. And then all of a sudden he springs up and you see him racing across hill and dale to catch up because he wants the adventure and a symbolic attitude and the promise of greater meaning and the promise that there is much more to us and what we can learn. I think is the call to adventure, the inner adventure.
Yes.
Doesn't that sound like more fun?
Well, it's certainly enlivening that there's something just dull about concretizing and literalizing and reducing everything into this dry and dusty place. Just to finish the thought I was going to before about religious literalism, it is a great demonstration of the power of the unconscious that our Bible in the Western world includes the book of Revelation, which is a group of images that just refuses to be interpreted literally. And in many people's churches, when they confront their church leaders about the meaning of the book of Revelation, there's just a collapse around it. And often people are told, well, we just don't know. We just don't know. We don't know what it means. So let's focus on over here. Let's focus on the stuff that we can concretize and literalize. And that's just a mystery.
Yeah.
But this feeling
it's, again, dismissed.
Yeah, and dismissed that that there is no place to approach clearly a symbolic dynamic that requires a knowledge of symbols, because then that would open up. The cat would be out of the bag.
Yeah, I think that you could make an argument that literalism, if overdone, gives rise to fundamentalism.
Oh, absolutely.
And that fundamentalism requires literalism in order to be sustained.
Absolutely.
So in some sense, the symbolic attitude is the great liberator.
It is totally the great liberator. And it must be repressed in a oppressive regime, whether it's in a regime of thinking or a social regime.
Yes.
Because it's dangerous. Liberation is dangerous. Freedom is dangerous.
It's dangerous to the system that does not want to change.
And it's dangerous to our internal system to open up some of the things that we might not want to see so well. The example in the Christmas Carol of it was hard for Scrooge. It was not a pretty, pleasant process for him to see who he really was. And yet, of course, it was worthwhile. Adventures are dangerous.
And on an intrapsychic level, if you've got a weak ego structure that cannot tolerate being knocked off as, knocked off its throne as king without total overwhelm to the psyche, then you do have to have this kind of fundamentalist character structure where the ego defenses are very rigid and kind of have to stay literal to keep all the other stuff at bay. But if we have a strong enough ego that we can kind of dance with our unconscious, then that's I think what we're sort of hoping for.
And a fundamentalist attitude is not limited to a religious structure.
No.
Many people come in and they were raised in homes that were incredibly concrete and fundamentalist in as much as these are the rules and you will obey and you're going to follow them. And whether they were religiously inspired or simply handed down culturally through family beliefs, but this is how you'll dress and this is the kind of person you'll be. And there's no room for anything else getting in there.
Right. Well, and I'm even extending it to, I think that both sides of the political spectrum in the United States right now tend to be fundamentalists, the left as well as the right. And it's that this is what it is and this is what it will be. And you can't question the meaning around it. And you can't generate alternative hypotheses. And there's no room for nuance. And it's kind of either this or that.
I think the hobgoblin under all of this is fear.
Yeah.
That it's scary to go against the dictates of your family or a religion or a cultural attitude and your own inner world of that. At least the promise is, or the false belief is, that you'll be safe if you stay within these bounds.
Right. And so now we're back again to literalism as a defense.
Yes. The liberation can be scary. Adventures are two-sided.
Well, you never know what you're going to find.
Exactly. You really don't know what you're going to find. That is the whole point of adventure. And then there is the counterpull toward, build a fort, make the walls really thick, and you'll be safe.
Yeah.
You'll have your castle with a drawbridge, and nobody can get in unless you let them in.
Well, and literalism can show up in many unexpected forms. So I don't know if you guys remember many years ago, the Heaven's Gate religious cult where they were all found dead. And so the leader had this inner vision that I think it was the Hale-Bopp comet was going to come, close to the earth. And there was this inner image for the leader that all of their souls could hop a ride, could jump onto the Hale-Bopp comet and escape out into this fantastically larger and better universe. And that was an accepted kind of idea that was thought of very concretely. Yep. And so there was, at this particular astronomic moment, a demand that everybody commit suicide. And then there was evidence that people were then forced to take this poison, that no one, quote unquote, was going to get left behind because the image was concretized.
Yep.
So things can well up inside of us that really can only safely live in a symbolic conversation.
Well, because I think that in many cases, that's where they are, and that's where they're supposed to live.
Right, they're meant to mediate, just as we said, that the fantasy of the Hale-Bopp comet, let's say, was really meant to mediate something in that person's psychology, which was potent enough to feel godlike, to numinous enough to feel like a spiritual revelation. But the leader's failure to have a symbolic attitude, or perhaps even to know about it,
what might we imagine?
It's a great example.
Symbolically, if we take the other half of this, what might we imagine that comet symbolized? What, symbolically speaking, might they have been in quest of?
Certainly transcendence.
Yes. Enlightenment, transcendent. It's truly a spiritual quest, but spirit got quashed and squished into a horrible little container of you have to lose your literal life instead of symbolically what it means to lose one's literal life. And that's all over the body, all over the Bible is to lose your life in order to gain it. It's not meant to be taken literally. And it's unspeakably sad that the symbolic meaning that could have been enlivening in every possible way met with such a dismal end.
And this goes into tremendous symptoms like psychosis.
Yes.
Where an individual's, the part of their soul and the part of their brain that holds these incredible, generative, fantastical images and ideas kind of opens up, and the ego now has overwhelming access to all of this extraordinary content. And if there is no symbolic attitude, it's all just felt to be real.
Right.
And that's dangerous.
Yes. Well, and speaking of symbols, I'm wondering if this might be a good time to go to a dream.
Let's do it.
So we have a dream this week from a female dreamer who is aged 57, and her occupation is writer. And here's the dream. I had a wild animal skin. At first, I thought it was a zebra skin, but then I realized it was something more rare and dangerous, the skin of a white tiger. I knew it was wrong and illegal to have it, but I loved it, and it felt so warm, comfortable, and safe to be inside it. And here's what the dreamer tells us about the context. She says, I am in what I hope is the last big push for recovery from childhood trauma. I strive to reclaim my rightful place in the world. And in terms of the main feelings in the dream, she says, feeling comfortable and safe in something that was considered dangerous.
So I love in her context that she's already signaling to us that she's adopting a symbolic attitude.
Mm-hmm.
She's already taken the tiger as something which she could imagine was unsafe, tiger-like roaring, slashing feelings or behaviors, and that the tiger had been transformed into a skin which then could be used as a protection and as a comfort. So she's really done a nice bit of her own interpretive work. That's quite wonderful.
Mm-hmm. The feeling tone is, what does she say about how she felt about the dream, Lisa?
She says, feeling comfortable and safe in something that was considered dangerous.
So there's a way of an acceptance and kind of reveling in her wild animal, instinctual side. I'm thinking about the zebra and the tiger are both very dramatically marked.
And a white tiger is striped. It's white with black stripes.
Yes.
And so they're similar, right?
So that's interesting. Of the polarity between black and white, of something is united in a wonderfully dramatic pattern that where black and white each have their place, but together they make for something very beautiful.
So I find myself drawn to just the first word, and rather than just taking the ego's grammatical presentation of the dream, but just, I had a wild animal skin. Now, there's a way in which that could mean that I was in possession of a wild animal skin, but it also, nuanced, could mean that I literally used to have a skin that was the skin of a wild animal at a previous time. And when I think about how painful and how troubling extreme trauma is, particularly trauma that happens to us as children, that people can become profoundly wild in all manner of ways. And actually not even just childhood. I'm thinking now about guys that come back with PTSD, and all of a sudden, with no previous history of it, there's domestic violence issues and all kinds of wildness. And they have, animal skin, so to speak, when they come back from war. So that image of, at the beginning of the journey, one has, in fact, the skin of an animal. That's very powerful. And of course, leans into all kinds of fairy tale stuff.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I'm thinking too is that an animal hide is sort of protective. And so this could show a kind of defense, perhaps a very necessary defense. I mean, defenses are not bad things, right? We need them. And if one has had childhood trauma, one needed to have some defenses. And that does lean into the fairy tale that I like to call Manyfur, because I've never been successful at pronouncing the German name.
I think it's Alalera. Took me a while to get that.
We'll say that one more time.
Alalera.
Oh, that's so musical.
It is.
But for those of you who may not know the fairy tale, it is in Grimm's. And it's really one of the few explicit incest fairy tales. There's a king who is married to a beautiful woman, and he has a daughter, and his wife dies. And he is overcome with grief, and he decides that he's only going to marry someone who was as beautiful as his wife. And he looks around and he sees his daughter, and he says, I'm going to marry you. And she says, okay, but first make this dress for me of all silver and that sort of thing. It's kind of like a stalling tactic. So she gets these 3 beautiful dresses that are all tucked away, and then she runs away and hides in the woods and covers herself with pelts from many different animals so that she looks like a sooty, dirty animal. And the resolution is that she begins to work in the nearby king's kitchen as kind of a scullery maid. And eventually, the king falls in love with her, and she gets to put on the beautiful gowns, and it all ends happily. But it's this image of hiding oneself in sort of animal pelts and all the symbolism around that as a way of protecting oneself against the wounds of incest.
Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking about the sentence in the dream that says, I knew it was wrong and illegal to have it, but I loved it.
Mm-hmm.
And it felt so warm, comfortable, and safe to be inside it. So it is sort of the protective layer, something that's, and I see the tension between the ego, the dream ego that says, oh, this is really wrong, and it's really not right to do this with animal skins. And then the other part that says, but it really feels great to be all snuggled up inside it. So there is it seems to me, a defensive persona here, that she will appear as a white tiger or the zebra, which she thought something black and white.
So what I think is interesting about that, I think you're right. It's sort of a defensive persona, but the quality of it has really changed because we've got two possibilities that are both black and white stripes, but one is a prey animal and the other is a predator.
Ah.
And, I'm assuming that the reference to it's illegal to have it is partly because white tigers are extremely rare.
Yes.
They're a genetic variation and they're very rare. And so I'm sure it's illegal to have tiger skins, period. But boy, that one, this would be real. This would be an extremely rare object and difficult to acquire. But it's this idea, what my imagination is about this dreamer is we all need a persona and we all need defenses. And if we suffered abuse as a child, we may not have learned how to protect ourselves. I mean, that's one thing that childhood trauma does is it gets in the way of a development of a sense of how you protect yourself out in the world.
Right. The right relationship to aggression as well.
Yes.
And I'm thinking about kids who love to dress up and sometimes dress up as animals. And what it would feel like to take on some of the qualities that we take on. I'm thinking of Halloween costumes, of what it feels like to be dressed up as a superhero.
Mm-hmm.
What would it feel like to be dressed up as a white tiger, rare and dangerous, and then to be able to integrate some of those tiger qualities.
Well, and it's nice in a way that it is something she can take on and off.
Yes.
It means, perhaps, my imagination here, that she's not acting aggressively in a kind of compulsive way, but can choose to resort to that when necessary, which is a very integrated, individuated way of handling aggression.
She has the power when she needs it.
And so putting a little frame around that, I want to talk about the idea of archetypal defenses. So in my fantasy, and of course we don't know this person, that when we're very young and we're put up against terrible trauma, there is something in the spirit of a child that wants to survive. And the soul of the child is able to call to itself certain images, impulses, and archetypes to shore it up, to give it what it needs to muscle through what looks like an impossible, unsurvivable situation. So we might even imagine that in the midst of the distress the dreamer had, that something like a wild animal, a white tiger even, comes to her and becomes her companion and merges with her, so that as she matures into adulthood, she is an amalgam of a young woman and a tiger, and is also evidencing all of the aggressive and defensive behaviors of a tiger. And it's illegal in the psyche to remove the archetypal defense. There is a rule in the psyche to not muck around or poach the precious defenses that you need to survive. What happens often in a deep healing analysis is that people begin to understand that this was a defense being merged with the white tiger, was a defense that was necessary and life-sustaining at a certain point. And then later in life, it becomes a liability. It's very hard to date somebody who's part tiger and not get mauled. So this growing awareness that the archetype must be sacrificed, and the first approach to the sacrifice of the defense is to feel that this is illegal, in the inner law system. This is transgressive and must not happen. And yet, in this very small dream, somehow a part of her said no, that the inner white tiger has to be sacrificed and transformed into a symbol, into a representative object, which is a pelt, that it has to be removed from its living potency, returned to the spirit world, so to speak, and I'm left just with a talisman of the tiger, and brushing against the talisman of the defense, the pelt, I feel warm and comfortable, but I am no longer a tiger woman.
Yes, that's great, Joseph. Really, that's really great.
That's beautiful.
And I think you guys were saying that, actually.
The power of that is now available to the ego to use in an integrated way.
And in an intentional way.
Yes.
She can put it on and she can take it off. So there's choice, there's consciousness involved.
Yeah, but you're right. Implicit in the image is that the tiger has been killed.
And she had to break an internal rule to do that.
Yeah.
That's the illegality of it.
Yeah.
And I think that's very wonderfully wise in the dream.
Yes, it
that
is.
we do feel like we're doing something wrong when we challenge our defenses.
So something has been sacrificed here.
Something that was precious.
Yeah.
And our survival defenses when we're traumatized were precious. I mean, who knows how bad it would have been without them.
Right.
Well, I think that feels like a place to stop for today.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.